This is Tokens. I'm Lacey Camp.
Now, with the dark magic of negative partisanship, the primary focus of the right and also many folks on the left is just opposing the other.
That is David French, conservative political commentator and senior editor for The Dispatch and contributing writer for The Atlantic. As a conservative, David has been through some hell and high water because he's been willing to critique the alt-right, Donald Trump, and white Christian nationalism.
I mean, I would say within minutes, I saw the first image of my youngest daughter photoshopped into a gas chamber with a photoshopped picture of Donald Trump in an SS uniform pressing the gas button.
And yet, in the midst of that, he keeps insisting on certain political values.
Kindness and decency. Love your enemies. Bless those who persecute you.
All this coming right up. David French is an American political commentator, previously a fellow at the National Review Institute, where he was also at that time a staff writer for the National Review. He currently serves as senior editor of The Dispatch and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Completed his undergraduate degree at Lipscomb University, where we overlapped for several years.
We did indeed.
When we were young whippersnappers way back then. Then on to Harvard Law School, served in the U.S. Army, was deployed to Iraq, serving as a squadron judge advocate, and since that time has done a great deal of legal work in religious rights issues. Welcome, David French.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you here. So yeah, it was a long time ago that we were running around campus together.
It doesn't feel that, especially when I drive down Granny White and I see high rise and it all comes flooding back.
Yes, that's right. That's right. They do go by. They go by very, very quickly. And but those were very good days. I want to start with a label. Wikipedia has you down as a theologically conservative traditional Christian. And of course, you're known as a conservative American political commentator. Uh-huh. So let's talk about those two labels, conservative and traditional.
Right.
To what degree are you comfortable applying those labels to yourself? And what do such labels you think mean to you at their best?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I am decreasingly comfortable applying the label conservative in one sense, yet fight for it in another. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me unpack that a little bit. There is a sort of a broader idea of what when people hear the word conservative, how they define it themselves and what they think of as conservative. Yeah. I'm less comfortable with that. I want to fight for the idea of conservatism that I sort of grew up with and have, adopted over the years. So, for example, you will hear somebody say now, I am a very staunch conservative. And that is a code for saying I am a very strong supporter of Donald Trump, for example, or I'm a very strong Republican. And those two things are not the same. They're just not the same. And so if you say to somebody, well, I'm conservative, that's going to communicate a meaning to them that you may not intend. Yeah. So, I grew up in a conservatism that, the old cliche is it sort of had three main elements, a political conservatism that had three main elements. And then we could talk about the theological part. Yeah. The three main elements were sort of a more modest view of the role of government, more limited government, not no government, but more limited, more modest view of what government could accomplish. A social conservatism, in other words, pro-life, supported religious liberty, strongly believed in the need for character and leadership and political leaders, church leaders, business leaders, homes, and then also was a very strong believer that in sort of what you might call the post-World War II international order, the network of alliances that maintain great power, peace, and the network of international relationships that the United States had that maintained great power, peace, and helped facilitate an enormous amount of increasing global prosperity. That's what I meant when I said conservative. And if you said conservative for years and years and years, that's generally, there's a lot of room for disagreement in there. But now what we have is something entirely different that's arising. Conservatism is becoming less of a coherent ideology and much more of a particular attitude. So the role of the government is up for grabs. The role of the United States in the world is up for grabs. Social conservatism is still there, but it's being subsumed within a larger sort of culture war struggle. So, for example, two of the biggest culture war items of the last 18 months have been culture wars over masks and vaccines. That would be unrecognizable to a social conservative in years past. And the better way to describe it is what is sort of this new conservatism, which I just call right-wing or populist, is that its primary animating force is animosity. It's better described as anti-left. It's not necessarily coming to the public square with, here's our specific platform of ideas that will lead to human flourishing and greater, peace and prosperity here at home and abroad, although there are ideas along those lines. But it's much more, I am against you. I am not you. And which is one of the roots of, for example, the vaccine and mask wars is, well, where did the sort of, the masks were seen as a condensed symbol of sort of this elitist public health establishment. Similarly, a lot of the move towards pushing people to take the vaccine. And so it triggered an oppositionalism. And that's not what I grew up with. That's not what I believe.
How do you see the alliance or straining of that alliance with so-called traditional Christianity with conservatism that you grew up with and the conservatism that is quickly developing?
Yeah. So, when I looked at the interplay between my Christian faith and my political ideology, the way I looked at it is that my political ideology was downstream of and contingent. In other words, I didn't believe that my political ideology flowed naturally from my religious beliefs. It was disputable. But I believed that my political ideology was certainly informed by my religious beliefs. I believed that the beliefs that I held ideologically were consistent with, and perhaps in some instances, arguably more consistent with my Christian faiths and some of the competing alternatives. But that was arguable. That was debatable. So, for example, any particular view of the American economic system, let's talk about that. Here's why I believe it. Here's why you might disagree. We'll have that discussion. Any particular view of American foreign policy, here's what you think. Here's what I think. Let's talk about it. But what I've found about a lot of the modern new right, it is in its fundamental moral posture, what I would say is sometimes you might call it post-Christian. Sometimes I might call it just flat out unchristian for this reason, that what I said earlier is an enormous amount of it is based on animosity. Okay, it's based on animosity. Yeah. And that is, that's a big shift from where conservatism you might have thought of conservatism 10 or 15 years ago, which was based on a set of ideas that you thought would be better for the country. And now with the dark magic of negative partisanship, the primary focus of the right and also many folks on the left is just opposing the other.
I think the way that you put that early on, you presumed that your political stance was downstream of your faith and that the connection from your faith to the political stance was arguable.
Yes.
That seems crucial to me. And because it increasingly seems that there are many on the right, many on the left that can't see these as arguable,
yes,
but as unnecessarily you must stand here if you're going to claim this kind of faith.
Yeah, well, they would say that, they would also say my politics is downstream from my faith, but my politics is there is but one channel.
Yeah. One way you can go once you claim this. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, talk a little bit about at its best, then, as you kind of presumably you continue to hold a stance where you think that your American political stances are arguable conclusions or arguable postures from your faith. But at its best, what do you feel like are some pertinent goods
Right.
that come from your Christian faith that you argue into different political policies or practices that you think are really important right now.
Yeah. So if we want to just get nerdy, instead of using like more sweeping labels like conservative, I would say the most precise label to describe me is classical liberal.
Yeah.
That would be the most precise. But you say classical liberal, unless somebody's like up on these debates, their eyes glaze over and then all they hear is like liberal.
I do hope that people, by the time they've listened to you on this podcast, they know at least generally what that, right?
But your listeners are up. Your listeners are ready for this. So.
They've at least heard Patrick Deneen talk about this at great length. Yeah,
so I'm classical liberal. And so, my view on America's classical liberal structure is that there's some, although I don't think that I'm not going to sit here and say that there's one particularly divinely inspired mode of government. I think classical liberalism has some Christian, as a structure and approach, has some Christian virtues to it. And really they're twofold. One is classical liberalism at its best recognizes the inherent dignity of man. Okay, so this is the great sort of mission statement of the United States. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the fundamental social compact of the United States, articulated in the Bill of Rights, and then expanded and made enforceable through the Civil War amendments that really breathed life to our Constitution in a way that it didn't have life before. So these are the things that recognize there is a fundamental obligation of the government to recognize your basic human dignity, your right to speak freely, your right to exercise your religion, your freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, your entitlement to due process before your liberty is taken away. All of these things these are fundamental recognitions of the dignity of man, and I think echo in sort of the recognition of human beings as image bearers. So that's point one. And then point two is our classical liberal structure also recognizes the fallenness of man and is not excessively idealistic about man's nature. So here you have the checks and balances, the limits of the power of the state. There's no, so this is when you get to the Federalist Papers. Well, when the founders explicitly recognize that no man is an angel and men are not angels. And so we try as much as possible to control for and limit the ability of the tyrant or the dominating individual to strip us of our dignity. So I think of the classical liberal system as having those two great virtues that attach to it. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. I think that though for classical liberalism, a classical liberal structure to survive, I think it also has to rely on other institutions, such as a thriving family, such as a healthy church, such as civic associations. And those are the things that give us that day-to-day meaning and purpose. Classical liberalism doesn't. I mean, it did for me because I was a religious liberties lawyer, so I'm getting up in the morning defending liberty. But for most of us, you're not sitting around thinking, what's making my day happy? Due process. That's not how we are. But what classical liberalism does is it creates a space for human flourishing, for not just individuals, but institutions to thrive. So that's when I talk about my philosophy at its best. That's how I see it.
Yeah. So a cynical sort of critique, and I've used this kind of language even myself when talking about classical political liberalism, but before I use that language, I want to say that I think, too, the two things that you point to, the dignity of humankind, of all people, and a sober-minded recognition of the fallen, to use like scriptural language or theological language, the fallenness of humankind. I agree. Those are two terribly helpful commitments that we get to, at least analogically, through Christian practice. But your notion there that this can't thrive apart from flourishing in other institutions. Negatively put, some would suggest, that what that ultimately means is that democracy and or classical political liberalism is almost parasitic on these institutions in the sense that it doesn't have at its heart a capacity to do moral formation.
I dispute that on a couple of grounds. I think it's symbiotic with, not parasitic on. In the true sense of symbiosis, where both benefit from each other. So, for example, when you're talking about moral formation. Let's just take this. In many ways, the Bill of Rights itself and the Civil War amendments are moral teachers. They are not morally neutral documents.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the dignity of man with due process, or the right of the person to be secure in their body and that protection against unreasonable search and seizure, or the right to free exercise of religion or free speech, which Frederick Douglass called the great moral renovator of society and government, these things are positive goods. So one of the ways I kind of immediately am less impressed with the critique of classical liberalism is if they just say it's all about neutral principles. No, there are neutral principles that are in there. In other words, providing neutral access to the public square is an aspiration of classical liberalism. But due process, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, the rights secured in the First Amendment, these are positive goods. The statements in the great moral and legal declarations of the 14th Amendment that grant us equal protection under the law, for example, these are positive moral goods. So there is a moral formation that comes along with learning the principles of American classical liberalism. At the same time, the freedom secured by classical liberalism facilitates institution building. And so it's not parasitic
or makes space for.
It certainly makes space for it, and then provides formal legal protection for it. So one of the great virtues of the combination of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause is.
Quick clarification in case you need the reminder. The Establishment Clause is the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that prohibits the establishment of any national religion by the government. The Free Exercise Clause leaves individuals free to practice quote-unquote religion as they choose, so long as it does not violate so-called compelling governmental interests or quote-unquote public morals.
One of the great virtues of the combination of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause is it says, we're not going to create an overwhelming national church that's going to inhibit the growth of other perspectives. And in fact, not only are we not going to have that overwhelming national church, we're also going to affirmatively protect your ability to form your own institution and protect it against the power of the state. But at the same time, classical liberalism depends on reciprocal responsibilities. And so the way I put it, I like the phrase ordered liberty, okay? So the Declaration of Independence is a declaration of liberty. You're endowed with their unalienable rights. There's a wonderful letter that John Adams wrote to the Massachusetts militia. The famous quote that he makes is really, to me, the less interesting quote, but he talks about, the famous quote from that is our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. That's the famous. But the whole letter's worth reading because he talks about how a detour away from sort of fundamental character and virtue will cause vice, and he listed vices like avarice and ambition and all of these, to go through the cords of our Constitution like a whale through a net. And so essentially, a functioning constitutional classical liberal republic says government has obligations to us to secure our liberty, and we have an obligation to exercise our liberty for a virtuous purpose. And when we lose sight of that reciprocity, the system strains.
Recently, we had Professor Patrick Deneen on the show. He's a political philosopher and author of the book, Why Liberalism Failed. He's basically making the argument that classical political liberalism at root defines freedom as liberty from constraint, as opposed to ancient Greek and or Christian notions of liberty, which define liberty as the capacity to do what is good. And then he argues that what's happened is that both conservative liberals and liberal liberals have had their particular area where they're especially interested in freedom from constraint. So conservative liberals have wanted freedom from constraint with regard to commerce, business interests, and so forth. Liberal liberals have wanted, especially with regard to the bodies or social mores or whatever. And he says, then they both wanted to limit the other.
Right.
But what he says they've been both particularly successful in maximizing liberty in the area they're interested in, and both unsuccessful in limiting the other side.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fair description of what's happened with classical political liberalism?
Well, so I read Denin's book, and part of it felt like he was taking aim at French Revolution liberalism more so than American Revolution liberalism, which was very much a casting of restraint. At the height of the French Revolution, remember they were ransacking churches. They were renaming the months of the year. It was just a total break from any respect for the past. And, Edmund Burke famously despised the French Revolution and had respect for the American Revolution because they were different in nature and kind. But I would say that while I don't agree with all of the aims of progressive liberalism, and progressives certainly don't agree with all the aims of conservative liberalism, our inability to stop the other in the exercise of their liberty is a virtue of liberalism. Because if one of the defects of each side of the political spectrum is a impulse, which is, again, this is controlling for, what does liberalism do at its best? Control for our fallen nature. We all have a temptation of freedom for me and not for thee. And we often have a temptation that says, I am interested only in the liberties that I like and completely disinterested in the liberties that I don't care about. And so these are temptations, I think, of our fallen nature. And what liberalism does is at its best, is it really limits our ability to carve out zones of freedom of action for ourselves and not others. And I think that that's been a success of American liberalism. And I don't buy the argument that the present American legal structure represents a degradation of our constitutional order. In fact, I think America right now is closer, when it comes to the relationship of the state to the citizens, to what you might call a biblical model of justice than it's been arguably in its entire history. Now, are the citizens of the United States as virtuous as we would like? Well, a lot of the animosity, for example, that marks our political temperament would indicate no. A lot of the destructive behaviors that have degraded the family, for example, would indicate no. Other things would indicate no. But, one of the things, if you want to look back at America's past, ask yourself this question. Aside from being a white male Protestant, okay, when is another time in American history when you'd rather be alive? Let's put aside for a moment technology, and we all love our iPhones, but from the standpoint of equal treatment from the law and equal opportunity in society, what is the golden age compared to now?
Is that in particular what you just pointed to, what you meant earlier when you said you think that this point in American history is closer to the biblical vision of justice than any other time in our history?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So your critiques of conservatism began, I guess, coming really to the fore in 2015, 2016?
Right, yeah.
With a poke at Ann Coulter. Is this kind of what begins to originally make this so significant for you?
Well, I would say my ordeal began with a poke at Ann Coulter. I would always critique this or that thing.
Yeah.
I remember I wrote a really extended piece for Commentary magazine back at the height of the controversy over Trayvon Martin, where I basically said, wait, hold on a second. This side taking where you seem to be, having no sympathy for the plight that Trayvon Martin faced, and treating the entire prosecution and investigation as if it was a hoax. That was one of my first times, really publicly sort of saying to a popular trend in conservatism, you might want to pump the brakes a little bit. And I was always always a consistent civil libertarian in that I would protect the rights of people of all faiths and all points of view. But in 2015, when Trump began to rise, I was pretty appalled at what I was seeing. And it wasn't just sort of Trump's lack of character. It was the open flirtation, really open flirtation with a lot of themes and ideas that I knew to be lurking in the white nationalist underbelly of America. And so what happened is, I believe it was August 2015, Ann Coulter was tweeting some things out during a Republican presidential debate, primary debate, that were echoing the exact themes that you'd read in alt-right rhetoric. And oh my gosh, was there a backlash when I did that. And that's when it sort of ripped open and I saw that dark, dark underside.
So, but before you go on, so what in particular did you tweet or say in response to Ann Coulter?
It was a very short post in the group blog on National Review called The Corner. And it was essentially saying Ann Coulter tweeted this, and I can't even remember exactly what it was, something about how Israel can have a wall, but we can't, or something along those lines. And I said, you may not know this, but these are themes advanced by the alt-right. What is the alt-right? The alt-right's white nationalists, racists. And that was that. And I posted it, didn't think a thing about it. I mean, when you're in my kind of world, you're always critiquing something and receiving criticism. I mean, it's just part of it all. And I would say within minutes, I saw the first image of my youngest daughter photoshopped into a gas chamber with a photoshopped picture of Donald Trump in an SS uniform pressing the gas button. My wife's blog at Pathos was filled, the comment section was suddenly filled with images of dead and dying African Americans. I mean, gruesome stuff. Pictures of my daughter photoshopped into slave fields. It was horrible. It was horrible. And that was the beginning of an unbelievable ordeal that sort of continued off and on ever since then. With threats, with acts of cyber harassment, attempted intimidation, doxing. Doxing is when somebody finds your personal information and posts it online. So white nationalists have doxed us, posted our personal information, which has then been used for cyber harassment campaigns. So that really launched. I saw all of that happen, and it was stunning. I mean, it was stunning. One of my responses to it really was to feel shame, because I had heard, I had sat and I had listened to, Black friends describe acts of racism directed against them. And it all felt distant, it felt distant. That's a shame. I'm sorry that happened. And then all of a sudden it's directed at your own daughter in this just brutal, gruesome way. And then it makes it all so personal. I said this, I was on a TV hit some time ago, and I basically said, hey, look, don't be like me. Don't be like me, where it takes it coming into your own, the hatred directed at your own family before you wake up. Listen to the testimony of others and respond to the testimony of others. I mean, evangelicals should be, we grew up listening to testimonies. Hear the testimony of others and believe the testimony of others and react and respond accordingly. And I had heard the testimony of others, but it hadn't hit in the heart. And in the same way, of course, that kind of, avalanche of hate directed, and, my youngest at the time was 7 years old. What'd she ever done to anybody? And then the other thing that might have been, in some ways, even more disturbing, that's a kind of a big thing to say, but in some ways, quite very disturbing for other reasons, was the reaction of people to this. So close friends of mine were stricken. We can't believe this is happening. What do you need? Do you need to, stay at our house for a while things cool down, But you get one step removed, and immediately the concern was, don't let that hurt your support for Trump. The immediate concern was not what was my family experiencing, but would it change or influence the way I thought about Donald Trump? And so on the one hand, you can say, sure, that little nest of vipers that we stirred up is small. But on the other hand, where really are your priorities if you hear this has happened and you're immediately defaulting to, well, don't make a big deal about it. Don't make a big stink about it.
What was that like for you just in learning to process that kind of public attack?
When I learn how to process it, we'll have to do another podcast. I think just to be transparent about it, it's a work in process.
Yeah.
Because just when you think that, okay, I've got like this thick skin, another round of it will break out, and you're calling the police again, and they're coming by your house again, and you'll reach this point like I just can't believe this is the way things are, and then there's another dynamic, and then there's also, aside from the really dramatic stuff, there's just waves of hatred online, just huge waves of hatred, and there's this really interesting challenge that you have, which is this: if you're somebody who's talking in a public platform about difficult, complicated issues, you have to be open to criticism.
Right.
You got to be. I mean, do I have all the answers for, when I write about race issues and civil rights, do I have all the answers there? No. I have ideas. The ideas should be exposed to scrutiny and critiqued. You have to be open to critique. I mean, this is Micah 6:8, the last of the three-pronged admonition. Yeah. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly.
Yeah.
So if you open yourself up for critique, it can wound.
Yeah.
So then the temptation becomes to close yourself off.
Yeah.
Well, that's no good. So the best kind of compromise that I've tried to figure out is, how do you have a thick skin to ward off the bad faith nonsense, but an open heart to recognize legitimate critique? And that's a very difficult thing to achieve.
Any particular specifics of how you've figured out how to at least experiment with that? How to ward off the bad faith critiques, bad faith criticism, but hear people who are trying to make a legit critique? Yeah.
Well, a lot of it is you learn.
Yeah.
You learn who's good faith and thoughtful, and you learn who's bad faith and nasty.
Right.
and sometimes the identity of somebody you thought was good faith and thoughtful turns out to be, things change, they radicalize, whatever.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is just sort of this trial and error. And so, for example, I wrote a piece that was something along the lines of, "Is a nation of Christians a Christian nation?"
Mm-hmm.
And Ross Douthat from the New York Times wrote on his own Substack a pretty lengthy critique. Ross is a good guy. Ross is a smart guy. Ross is a kind man. If Ross has a problem with what I wrote, I want to read it and listen to it and respond to it.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other people who don't meet and I also have to realize that there are people who can be nasty and correct at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'll read a critique even if it's nasty, but if I know it's vicious and personal, you kind of disengage a little bit of yourself as you read it.
Yeah. How have you handled this with your family or with your daughter?
Well, with the oldest kids, they knew what was going on as soon as it started. And so, sadly, they've had to become aware of some of their own surroundings, and we kind of walked through it all with them. Because they were definitely old enough. My youngest, the best way to put it is, you just introduce the reality kind of step by painful step, because you don't just tell somebody. All of this started in 2015 when she's 7. You don't call in a 7-year-old and say, so it's, again, that's a work in progress as well.
You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, the Good Life, and we are most grateful to have you joining us. Please go over to tokenshow.com and sign up for our email list, or get info about how to join us for a live event. Again, that's tokenshow.com. Or you can contact us by emailing us at podcast@tokenshow.com. This is our interview with David French. Coming up, we'll hear about the admixing of Christian nationalism and the political right, as well as what it might look like to approach politics with kindness, open-mindedness, and humility. Part 2 in just a moment. Welcome back to Tokens and our interview with David French. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that you're especially pointing to as dangerous trends. So a little bit more about white Christian nationalism and what you're seeing develop and how you're trying to respond to that.
Yeah. So when you talk about Christian nationalism, often people will say things like, I've never heard a Christian nationalist sermon in my life. And from an intellectual standpoint, that might be correct. I don't know. But in some ways, we kind of have to define our terms. And you know, when I think of Christian nationalism, I think of a set of sort of intellectual and theological propositions, but more than that, I think of a set of emotional propositions. And Thomas Kidd has written about this very effectively, I think. And he has talked about defining Christian nationalism as sort of an intellectual or theological proposition that puts the American nation right smack in the middle of God's plan, that puts the American nation and the health of the American nation as important to the health of the church in a very special way, a transcendent purpose for the American nation that transcends the purpose of other nations, any other nation, all other nation, most other. So in other words, it's an intertwining of the nation and God's plan in a profound way. And a lot of people kind of adopt this without even realizing that they're adopting it. Then the other one is more the emotional connection, which essentially says America is a Christian nation rooted in faith. It often rests on a kind of a fictionalized history, one that speaks sort of, you have a history that sort of imagine a nation of devout founders and devout citizens, and any attacks on either the idea of that history, any changes that seem to adjust the nation from the trajectory, the imagined trajectory of that history, strike people in a deep emotional place. So when you're talking about the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they're not reading a sort of a Christian nationalism textbook. They have a very felt sense of emotional urgency that ties the church and the American nation and Donald Trump, believe it or not, all together in this sort of mixed stew that's often represented, with this T-shirt with the American flag, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. Yeah. And you're not quite sure which one is more deeply felt. So that, and when you really drill down into a lot of the data, a lot of the church right now is all about anti-wokeism, right? It's all about anti-wokeism. But if you drill down into sort of the evangelical church, the percentage of evangelicals who hold to some of fundamental quote unquote woke ideas, only around 5%. But if you talk about the percentage of evangelicals who hold to a significant chunk of outright Christian nationalist ideas, it's closer to around 50%. And so a lot of the anti-wokeism really is, in an interesting way, feeding the real temptation, because they're not tempted by wokeism.
Right, yeah.
It's feeding the real temptation, which is this Christian nationalism.
Because again, if you can be set in a posture of antagonism towards that, then you can much more immediately be comfortable with the white Christian nationalism.
Completely. And you rationalize the existence of the white Christian nationalism and the solidarity and camaraderie of it as a necessary response to this overwhelmingly powerful enemy force.
How do you narrate the historical currents that made that amalgamation possible at this point in history?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm sure you've read Jesus and John Wayne.
Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, is a book written by yet another Tokens guest, Kristen Dumais. It's described as a sweeping revisionist history of the last 75 years of white evangelicalism, revealing how many evangelicals have worked to replace the Jesus of the Gospels with an idol of rugged masculinity and Christian nationalism.
I find that narrative, overall narrative, to be quite directionally. I have my quibbles on here, this person that she might critique, or this example that she might use, but I think it's a directional matter. I think it's quite true, and I think she would even say that she didn't discuss the role of race maybe as much as you could also discuss in that context. But I think when you're talking about sort of the emergence of the Christian conservative, white Christian evangelical political project, a lot of it is, I'm not gonna say that, for example, the pro-life movement there aren't just a giant ton of really heartfelt folks in the pro-life movement. I've been a part of the pro-life movement my whole adult life, and I just know it's true that there are a ton of people who are just heartfelt, dedicated to life. But a lot of the other things that have animated the political engagement of white evangelicals, you can trace much more to history and culture and sociology than you can to theology. The greater predictor of evangelical support for Trump was the desire to limit immigration more than the desire to protect the unborn. And this is data from Ryan Burge from Eastern Illinois University, who took a look at the intensity with which evangelicals approach issues. The disproportionately Southern character of American white evangelicalism means that American white evangelicalism is disproportionately affected by the culture and history of the South, which has theological implications. The grievance-based mode of communication that exists within American conservative right-wing circles now, where everything is about who slighted us, who attacked us, has real echoes, in the way that it connects with Republicans, has real echoes with the shame honor culture that has long been the dominant culture down here in the South. So you can begin to sort of pull on different threads of deeply emotional issues. And when you pull on the thread, you don't see theology, you see sociology, or you don't see theology, you see history.
In your writing about white Christian nationalism, what do you think are the most plausible or potentially fruitful ways forward in helping debunk some of that?
Yeah. So that's a very, very good question. And it's a very difficult answer, because what I went back to was the emotion of it.
Right.
And the sense, and it's emotion that's not just a connection to nation. It's also a connection to community.
Right.
This is where your small group is.
Yeah.
This is where the guys you've been going to church with for 25 years are.
Sense of loyalty. And
so we often think of this as an intellectual project, and it's not that the intellectual arguments don't matter. They often matter a great deal once somebody is ready to be disentangled.
right. Yeah.
Have you heard the Jonathan Haidt elephant and rider persuasion analogy?
No.
This is fantastic. Haidt says that essentially imagine yourself as a combination of rider and elephant. The rider is your rational mind. The rider is the one that recognizes 2 + 2 is 4. The elephant is everything else. It is your ethnicity, your family history, your geographic location, your everything, your friendships, everything. And the way he says it
And
is,
probably even your brainstem as well.
Yeah. And the way he says it is, the rider can want to move, but if the elephant doesn't want to move, it's not moving. But conversely, if the elephant wants to move, the rider's coming. And this kind of makes instinctual sense. I mean, in my trial lawyer days, one of the first things I would want to do when I was communicating to a jury or communicating to a judge, make them want to rule for my client.
Right.
And make them want it. And then they'll find the reason, and that sounds kind of weird, but this really is so much of what persuasion is about. And in a weird sense, though, here's what ends up happening to us as political animals. We often say, well, I know I'm right. And once I expose you to my facts, then you'll see the error of your ways, and if you don't, it's your problem. We don't even understand the science of sort of polarization and partisanship and the science of it. Some of the science says that, for example, if I'm a deeply committed partisan, if you expose me to a fact that is counter to my deep commitments, I'll experience that as an attack. And so what I have told people is, look, we fact check, we do fact checks at the Dispatch, but a fact check is for an open heart and mind. If you've got some folks who are deeply embedded in some of these really toxic ideas, that's a relational issue far more than it's an intellectual issue.
Was it University of Michigan that did a study showing that if you expose a deeply committed partisan to competing facts, it just further entrenches them in partisanship?
It makes them angry.
It's a very troubling reality, you know.
Well, I get emails all the time from folks who say, you know, my aunt is all into Q now, or my uncle is all into Stop the Steal, or my whatever. And they'll say, what do we do about this? And one of the first things I respond with is how much time do you spend with them? Because what you have to understand for a lot of folks is their conspiracy is also their community. And their friendships are often contingent on their continued adherence in belief in the conspiracy or continued loyalty to the politician. There's this really great piece that my colleague Andrew Egger did about what are called these front row Joes. They're the people who were at the front row of all the Trump rallies. And it was really poignant how he described how they formed these friendships and these relationships. I would say deep, but they probably weren't deep enough to survive if any one of them stopped supporting Trump. And there's some really interesting research that shows that American men especially have a diminishing number of close friendships. And so what we're doing is we're finding alternatives to these close friendships and factional friendships online. And all of those are fragile. They're very contingent on us continuing to stay in the faction.
So Rob Omari, op-ed editor for the New York Post, had which I take was fairly widely read article in First Things entitled "Against David Frenchism."
Yeah.
It's impressive when your name becomes a...
it's a double-edged sword, I have to say.
Well, and it was fascinating because he starts out talking about how nice you are, but then...
my wife was like, we now know he doesn't actually know you very well.
But then he goes on to use that as a way of saying, but this is my problem I have with it. Yeah. So that... As I understand what he's getting at, I got a quote here. He says, French prefers a different Christian strategy, one with which I take issue. Such talk, that is his talk, of politics as war and enmity is thoroughly alien to French, I think, because he believes that the institutions of a technocratic market society are neutral zones that should in theory accommodate both traditional Christianity and the libertine ways and paganized ideology of the other side. So he goes on, I think, to kind of picture you as arguing for sort of naive pluralism, perhaps. So is that what you hear him saying, and what do you do with that?
So there were a couple of components of this. One is, first, politics is war and enmity, as you just said. Since it is war and enmity, for traditional virtues like kindness or decency are second-order values at best, or sometimes actual impediments. And that part of the problem, or much of the problem, is American classical liberalism itself. So you had kind of a mixture of a tactical critique with a giant substantive critique of liberalism. So if you're going to, what is David Frenchism in his mind? David Frenchism is the defense of American classical liberalism through decency and as much as, fallen people can do it, kindness as well. And so I'll take that. I'll take that. And so, part of my problem, as I explained in a lengthy rebuttal to this, is we can't view politics as war and enmity. I remember, there was a time, and I've written about this extensively, where I had an embarrassing degree of partisanship in hindsight. And it was this bad, Lee. I was at giving a speech to a red meat conservative crowd, and somebody was saying, you're doing great work at home here defending free speech, why would you go to Iraq? This is before right before I deployed to Iraq, and I was a reserve officer and then deployed, went active duty and deployed. And I said this with just, crowd pleasing. I believe the two great threats to America are radical leftists at home and jihadists abroad. And I feel called to fight them both. And yay, everybody cheers. And so then I go to Iraq and I see what war actually is. And I felt profoundly embarrassed that those words escaped my mouth. Profoundly embarrassed. So here I am. I'm a guy who went to law school in Cambridge, Massachusetts at a far left institution, had 3 of the best years of my life. Now, I had lots of conflicts, ideological conflicts with classmates, but I also made friendships that have lasted, including with folks on the left, that have lasted a lifetime. My son was born in Ithaca, New York when I was teaching at Cornell Law School. I think at that time it was the only city in America with a socialist mayor. We had a good life, We went to church every Sunday. And yeah, I disagreed with a lot of the policies there, and I disagreed with a lot of the aspects of the culture in Ithaca. But by golly, we had a good life. I could have zero life at all in the villages south of Balad Ruz, Iraq. I would have had my head separated from my shoulders almost instantly. If I was trying to just go down there and live. And I saw atrocities like you can't even imagine. And I had actually said those words. So I came back from Iraq zigging away from partisanship while it seems like the rest of the country was zagging towards it in an ever escalating manner. So I've seen, I've seen what war is, and it ain't a tweet battle. It isn't competing op-eds. It's not winning or losing an election or winning or losing a court case, even though those things are all important. So the war and enmity point, I just think is dangerously wrong. The more you tell some people something's war, the more they're apt to act like something's war. Then the other thing about kindness and decency, I don't know where a Christian makes that argument that that's their second order or contingent values. Love your enemies. Bless those who persecute you. What are the fruits of the Spirit? And we have to remember that those commands were issued at a time where if you want to argue evangelicals are embattled now, try making that argument to a first century Christian.
Yeah.
They would look at you and say, wait a minute, you're the most powerful faction of one of the two political parties, white evangelicals, the most powerful faction of one of the two most powerful political parties in the world, in the most powerful nation in the world, possessing untold sums of wealth, and you think the world's about to end. What are you talking about? My cousin was fed to a lion last week. And so even in that environment, and you hear things, Paul saying, you do not have a spirit of fear in that environment, but of power and love and of sound mind. And so these are not contingent or second order. They're primary commands. We're violating commands of Scripture if we're not abiding by them. And they're hard, and I don't do it perfectly.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is, we've already talked a lot about classical liberalism, so we don't need to rehash all of that. But I think, what you're talking about is a movement that rejects classical liberalism, embraces pugilism, and often in quite concrete ways is extraordinarily nasty and vicious towards those who disagree.
So, as we kind of come to a close here, a two-part question. One, what are ways in which you keep feeding yourself? How do you not fall prey yourself to the sort of reactionary fight back?
Yeah.
And then second, who are people, and it might be nice if you point to people both on the American left and the American right that you feel are good moral exemplars of people who are doing this well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So how do I not fall prey to it? One is just super practical. I don't marinate all day in politics and these fights. My best friends, you know a bunch of them from Lipscomb, they're not political guys, you know? So when I'm interacting with my closest friends, we're not interacting about politics.
Yeah.
I mean, rarely at all. My entertainment is not politics focused. I really, one of the things that I think is a real problem is that politics has sort of taken the place of religion in people's lives. And so I'm very cognizant of that as a challenge. And I don't want politics and political and cultural or engagement to become an idol. And one of the ways it becomes an idol is when it just sort of de facto by consuming your life. So I really don't want that to be everything that I do and am. So that's very important to me. The other thing is, I'm surrounded by cautionary tales because all around me, you see people who are giving in to that spirit of fear and rage and anger and hatred, and it leads nowhere good. So I on the one hand, I have people who love me no matter if I was Republican or Democrat. On the other hand, I'm surrounded by sort of these cautionary tales of people who are really indulging in that spirit of contention, and it just doesn't lead anywhere good. So that's just kind of super practical. And then I'm also grounded by some of the folks that I read. There's a lot of folks on the left and the right that I appreciate the way they engage. So a guy I always read is Ezra Klein. I've been on his podcast a couple times. I disagree with him a ton, but he approaches issues in good faith with a really sharp mind and an openness to engage. A person I read everything she writes is Elizabeth Brunig, was at the Times, now at the Atlantic. We disagree on a lot. I mean, she's a heck of a lot more socialist than I am. But this is a person who is putting Christ front and center in her life in an incredibly thoughtful way. And what that looks like is similar and different from me in really interesting and challenging ways. And then, just free thinking people, like one who's just writes beautifully and leans left of center, Caitlin Flanagan, also at the Atlantic. Just a brilliant writer, always provocative and challenging.
Yeah. We've been talking to David French, American political commentator, senior editor of The Dispatch, contributing writer for The Atlantic. David, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yes.
It's been a treat.
It's great to have you. Thanks so much. You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, The Good Life. If you'd like to hear more about issues related to this episode, you can get a competing account of classical political liberalism in our episode with Patrick Deneen entitled The Failure of Liberalism. And if you'd like to hear an account of the ways in which white supremacy played a role in the rise of the religious right in the U.S., check out our episode with Randall Balmer. David also mentioned Kristen DeMay's book, Jesus and John Wayne, and if you haven't heard the Tokens episode with Kristen, you might check it out, one of our most listened to and discussed episodes. Remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you've got feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Email us, text, or attach a voice memo, and send to the address podcast@tokenshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Ashley Bain, Tom Anderson, Carrie Harmon. Music beds by Zach and Maggie White and Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Jeremy Bain for studio engineering for this particular episode. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.